Hello everyone, I am Dr. Vineeta Laxmi and today I am going to discuss about the base of skull. Why are we studying it? Because working knowledge of anatomy of skull base is essential for effective surgical management of diseases of this area. So let us study the base of skull.
In this video, I will be discussing about the internal surface of the base of skull. Look at the entire internal surface of the base of skull. It is not a flat one. It is depressed at 3 different levels. They are known as cranial fossae. From anterior to posterior side, it is anterior cranial fossa, which is at the highest level. Slightly lower is the middle cranial fossa, and at the lowest level is the posterior cranial fossa. Let us study this 3 cranial fossae one by one, the bones that built it and the structures related to it. Before we study about the anterior cranial fossa, let us first study a bit about the internal of skull. Internal of skull can be divided into 2 parts, as the internal surface of the base of skull, what you are seeing now, and internal surface of the cranial vault or the skull cap. This skull cap is formed by frontal bone, 2 parietal bones and a occipital bone. The frontal bone is joined through a suture to the parietal bone, which is called as coronal suture, and in between 2 parietal bones there is a suture which is called as sagittal suture, and the 2 parietal bones are joined posteriorly to the occipital bone through a suture which is called as lambdoid suture. These sutures I have discussed in my previous video. So what you are seeing in this, there is a small triangular projection on the anterior aspect. This is called as frontal crest, as there is an attachment of fox cerebri over this. What is fox cerebri? It is a dural fold. As you trace it posteriorly, there is a sulcus in the midline which is called as sagittal sulcus. Sagittal sulcus is narrower in front but widens as it runs posteriorly. Okay, the lips or the margin of the sagittal sulcus gives attachment to fox cerebri. Okay, and what is its content? The sagittal sulcus has a content of superior sagittal venous sinus. Also, on the either side of the sagittal sulcus, on the parietal bone, there are small irregular pits. Okay, these are called as granular foveolae. This lodges the arachnoid granulations. As the age advances, this granular foveolae becomes larger in size and also become numerous. Arachnoid granulations absorb cerebrospinal fluid from the venous sinuses. Also, you can see there are vascular markings on the internal surface of the parietal bone. These vascular markings are due to middle meningeal vessels. At the antero-inferior angle of the parietal bone, this vascular marking is formed by the anterior division of the middle meningeal artery, and at the posterior-inferior angle of the parietal bone, these vascular markings are formed by the posterior division of the middle meningeal artery. Also, you can see that the internal surface is a bit ruffled. Okay, and this is due to impressions of the cerebral gyri. Let us now study about the anterior cranial fossa. This anterior cranial fossa is formed by orbital plates of the frontal bone, cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and jugum sphenoidal in the median plane of the sphenoid. Now let us see how it forms. The frontal bone practically takes 90-degree turn inward to form the orbital plates of the frontal bone. It forms the major part of the floor of anterior cranial fossa. Posteriorly, the orbital part is attached with the lesser wing of the sphenoid through a fine suture. You can see a fine suture over here. This is cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. In the middle, you see a triangular process that projects upwards from the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. This is called as crista galli. Crista galli provides attachment to the falx cerebri. Okay, what is falx cerebri? It is a dural fold. In between crista galli and frontal crest, there is a foramina which is called as foramen cecum. It is usually blind, but if it is patent, it transmits emissary vein that connects nasal mucosa with the superior sagittal sinus. Nasal mucosa to the superior sagittal sinus. In cribriform plate, you can see on either side of this crista galli there are tiny foraminas. These foraminas are 15 to 20 in number on either side. They transmit olfactory nerves which communicate with the olfactory mucosa of nose to the olfactory bulb which lies on either side of the crista galli like this. On its posterior aspect, the cribriform plate is attached to the body of sphenoid. On its junction posterolaterally, it gives a foramina which is called as posterior ethmoidal foramina. It gives passage to the posterior ethmoidal nerves and vessels. Similarly, on its anterior surface aspect, at the junction of orbital plate of the frontal bone, there are two large foraminas. These are called as anterior ethmoidal foramina, which transmits anterior ethmoidal nerves and vessels. Again, I will remind you that crista galli and frontal crest, these two provides attachment to the falx cerebri. In addition to it, falx cerebri has two borders. Free border is related to inferior sagittal sinus and attached border is related to the margins of superior sagittal sinus. Also, you should know that there are four dural folds. What are they? Falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli and diaphragma sali. Now coming to the posterior surface of the anterior cranial fossa. This is lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And as you can see that the medially it is broader but laterally it is tapered out. On either side, on the medial end, you can see there is a projection. This bony projection is called as anterior clinoid process. It provides attachment to the anterior end of free border of tentorium cerebelli. As I have already said that the tentorium cerebelli is one of the dural folds. Now, if you can see that on the medial side of the lesser wing, there are two roots. In between these two roots, there is a canal which is called as optic canal, and it transmits optic nerve with its meninges and ophthalmic artery. Now coming to the posteromedian aspect of this anterior cranial fossa. This is called as jugum sphenoidal. Okay, and it is actually the superior surface of the anterior part of the body of sphenoid. This one is the jugum sphenoidal, is the superior surface of anterior part of the body of sphenoid. Okay, deep to this there is sphenoidal air sinuses, and those sphenoidal air sinuses opens into the roof of nasal cavity. Now coming to the lateral side on either side of the cribriform plate. These are orbital plates of the frontal bone. Deeper to it is orbital cavity, and this internal surface of the orbital plate of frontal bone shows elevations and depressions. These are impressions of Celsi and gyri respectively of the projecting part of the frontal lobes of the brain. So in a nutshell, the content of anterior cranial fossa is projecting part of the frontal lobes of the brain. Now coming to the middle cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa is formed by boundary, okay, and the anterior boundary is formed by posterior border of the lesser wing of the sphenoid laterally, and in the median plane by the posterior border of the jugum sphenoidal. Jugum sphenoidal is a part of body of sphenoid bone. This anterior border separates middle cranial fossa from the anterior cranial fossa. Now coming to the posterior boundary. The posterior boundary is formed by the superior border of the petrous temporal bone laterally, and in the median plane by the dorsum sella of the sphenoid bone. It separates the middle cranial fossa from the posterior cranial fossa. Also coming to the floor of middle cranial fossa, it is formed by the cerebral surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. This one is the greater wing of sphenoid bone. Here it is marked. You can see on this side there is a line of suture. Okay, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, and also formed by the inner surface of the squamous part of the temporal bone. This one is the squamous part of temporal bone, and also formed by the anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now coming to the shape of the middle cranial fossa, it is butterfly in shape. Okay, it has got two portions. The median portion is formed by the body of sphenoid bone, and expanded lateral surface is formed by the greater wing of the sphenoid and the squamous part of the temporal bone. Now coming to the median portion of the middle cranial fossa, here lies the body of sphenoid. Okay, it is a cubicle in shape and it has got 6 surfaces. This one is the superior surface, 2 lateral surface on either side of the body of sphenoid, to which greater wing of the sphenoid bone is attached. Okay, and there is one anterior surface to which it is articulating with the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. One posterior surface which is continuous with the clivus of occipital bone, and there is one inferior surface which forms the roof of the posterior part of the nasal cavity on the either side of the median plane. I will be discussing about inferior surface later. Now coming to the superior surface of the body of sphenoid, from anterior to posterior side, there is a horizontal sulcus. You are seeing it is just behind the jugum sphenoidal. This horizontal sulcus is called as sulcus chiasmaticus. Sulcus chiasmaticus leads on either side to the optic canal. As you already know that optic canal lies in between the two roots of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And what are the structures passing through the optic canal? I have said earlier, optic nerve and ophthalmic artery. Optic nerve is a purely sensory nerve, and ophthalmic artery is a branch of internal carotid artery. Now, as we are talking about the sulcus chiasmaticus, you should know about the optic chiasma as well. Okay, optic chiasma is a part of brain where optic nerve crosses. Remember, it is a part of brain where optic nerve crosses. Optic chiasma, it is located at the base of brain, immediately inferior to hypothalamus. Also, optic chiasma lies a little above the sulcus chiasmaticus, which is a part of the body of sphenoid, and does not lie in direct contact. Means optic chiasma is the part of brain which lies at the base of brain. Okay, and optic chiasma lies in the body of sphenoid. Okay, now there is a sulcus chiasmaticus in front and sella turcica behind. This one is the sulcus chiasmaticus and this is sella turcica behind. Okay, sella turcica has got 3 parts. What are they? The 3 parts of the sella turcica is tuberculum sella, hypophyseal fossa and dorsum sella. What is tuberculum sella? It is the it forms the posterior boundary of the sulcus chiasmaticus. Okay, tuberculums with the and also on the tuberculum sella there is attachment of the diaphragma celli. What is diaphragma celli? It is again a dural fold, and it also forms the dural roof for pituitary gland. Okay, and there comes next to it, just behind it, is the hypophyseal fossa. It lodges the hypophysis cerebri or pituitary gland. It is the deepest part of sella turcica. Now, there is another structure just behind the hypophyseal fossa. It is dorsum sella. It is the square plate of bone that is projecting upward from the body of sphenoid. It is body of the sella turcica, you can say. And on the superior border you can see there are two projecting point on either side of this superior border. It is called as posterior clinoid process, and here there is an attachment of attached border of the anterior end of the tentorium cerebelli. If you can remember, the fixed border of the anterior end of the tentorium cerebelli was attached at the anterior clinoid process. So on the posterior clinoid process there is attached border of the anterior end of the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, now just look on the either side of the body of sphenoid. There is a wide sulcus. This one is the carotid sulcus. Okay, it lodges cavernous sinus containing internal carotid artery. If you can see, then it anteriorly it goes to the superior orbital fissure and posteriorly to the foramen lacerum on each side. Now, coming to the expanded portion. As we know that floor of the middle cranial fossa is formed by cerebral surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid, internal surface of the squamous part of the temporal bone, and anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now there is a roughly triangular passage that here you can see. This one is the roughly triangular passage which is bounded superiorly by the lesser wing of the sphenoid, inferiorly by the greater wing of the sphenoid on either side, and medially by the body of sphenoid. This triangular passage is called as superior orbital fissure. It is divided into three compartments by a common tendinous ring. The three compartments are lateral compartment, intermediate compartment, and medial compartment. So the structures passing through the lateral compartment are trochlear nerve, frontal nerve, lacrimal nerve, orbital branch of the middle meningeal artery, and lacrimal artery, out of which frontal nerve and lacrimal nerve are branches of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, and what are the structure passing through the intermediate compartment? They are superior and inferior rami of the oculomotor nerve, nasociliary nerve, which is branch of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, and abducent nerve. What are the structure passing through the medial compartment? It is inferior ophthalmic vein. Let us learn a bit about the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is a mixed nerve and it has got three divisions. They are ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, out of which ophthalmic and maxillary are purely sensory and mandibular is a mixed nerve. So it has got both sensory and motor component. Along the crescent line on the greater wing of the sphenoid, there are certain foramens. Just behind the superior orbital fissure, there is a rounded foramen on the anterior medial aspect of the greater wing of the sphenoid. It is called as foramen rotundum. It transmits maxillary nerve, which is sensory nerve, and just behind and lateral to this foramen rotundum, there is an oval foramen. This is called as foramen oval, and it transmits mandibular nerve, which is mixed nerve, accessory meningeal artery, lessa petrosal nerve, and emissary vein connecting cavernous sinus with the pterygoid venous plexus. Just behind and lateral on each side, there is a small foramina, if you can see here and here as well. This is called as foramen spinosum, and it transmits middle meningeal artery, which is branch of maxillary artery, and meningeal branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, which is also called as nervus spinosus. Okay. Now coming to another foramen, which is called as foramen lacerum. Okay. Why the name has been given as such? Because margins of this foramen is irregular, giving it a lacerated appearance. And what are its boundary? Posterolaterally by the apex of petrous part of the temporal bone, anteriorly by the body and the posterior border of the greater wing of the sphenoid, and medially by the basilar part of the occipital bone. Okay. And what it transmits? It transmits internal carotid artery, pterygoid vessels and nerve, and emissary vein from cavernous sinus to pharyngeal plexus of veins. Okay. Now, just on the anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone, there is just behind this foramen lacerum, there is a depressed area close to foramen lacerum. There is a depressed area which is called as trigeminal impression. It lodges, what it lodges? It lodges trigeminal ganglion. Just behind, just slightly behind this trigeminal ganglion, there is an elevated area which is called as arcuate eminence. Due to how it is formed? It is formed due to superior semicircular canals. Okay. As you know, ear is divisible into three parts: external ear, middle ear, and internal ear. Middle ear and internal ear is located within the petrous part of the temporal bone. Internal ear is further divisible into two parts: bony labyrinth and membranous labyrinth. In bony labyrinth, there are three semicircular canals. What are they? They are anterior, superior, and posterior canal. Superior semicircular canals form the arcuate eminence. Here you can see. Now coming to a thin plate of bone behind this arcuate eminence. This is, what is this? This is tegmen tympani, and it forms the roof for mastoid ventrum, tympanic cavity, that is the middle ear cavity, and bony part of auditory tube. Okay. Now what is the content of middle cranial fossa? It lodges temporal lobes of the cerebrum. Okay. With this, our middle cranial fossa is completed. Now coming to the posterior cranial fossa. It is largest and deepest of all the three fossas in the cranial base. Anteriorly, it is bounded by the superior border of the petrous temporal bone and dorsum sella, and posteriorly it is bounded by the occipital bone, squamous part of the occipital bone, and on each side by the mastoid part of the petrous bone, and also the mastoid angle of the parietal bone. Okay. The floor of occipital bone is formed by the condylar part of the occipital bone, posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, okay, and mastoid, internal surface of the mastoid part of the temporal bone. The main bulk of the posterior cranial fossa is formed by the occipital bone, and it lodges the cerebellum behind and pons and medulla ahead. Now coming to the floor, which represents a sloping area anteriorly, and this is called as clivus. It is formed by the union of basi occipit with the basi sphenoid. Okay, it lodges pons and medulla. Now, if you can see, there is a fissure on each side of the clivus. This is called as petro-occipital fissure. It lodges inferior petrosal sinus on each side. Now, just in the posterior part of the petro-occipital fissure, there is a foramen. You can see here, this is called as jugular foramen. By two bony spicules, it is divisible into three compartments: medial, intermediate, anterior compartment or intermediate compartment and posterior compartment. Anterior compartment transmits inferior petrosal sinus and gives passage to inferior petrosal sinus. Middle compartment transmits the cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, meningeal branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery, okay, and posterior compartment gives passage to internal jugular vein, then meningeal branch of the occipital artery and sigmoid sinus. Okay. The surface, which is bounded superiorly by the superior border of the petrous temporal bone and inferiorly by the petro-occipital fissure and jugular foramen, this surface is called as posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. Okay. In the middle of the surface there is a foramen. You can see on either side. It is called as internal acoustic meatus. It transmits facial nerve, which is a mixed nerve, and vestibulocochlear nerve, which is purely sensory nerve, and in between them there passes labyrinthine artery, which is branch of basilar artery. In the median plane, just behind this clivus, there is a foramen. This is called as foramen magnum. It is the largest foramen of skull, and it is bounded anteriorly by the basi occiput and on either side by the condylar part of the occipital bone and posteriorly by the squamous part of the occipital bone. This foramen magnum is divisible into smaller anterior and larger posterior compartment by a ligament, which is called as alar ligament, that is attached on the medial aspect of the occipital condyle. Occipital condyles lies on the external aspect of the occipital bone. I will be discussing it later on. Now, this smaller anterior compartment is called as osteoligamentous compartment, and the larger posterior compartment is called as neurovascular compartment. The name itself is suggestive because through the anterior compartment, what are the structures that pass? They are apical ligament of the tens, upper band of the cruciate ligament, and membrana tectoria. Okay, and through the posterior compartment, which is called as the neurovascular compartment, what are the structures that pass? They are lower part of the medulla, anterior posterior spinal arteries, okay, fourth part of the vertebral arteries, and spinal roots of the accessory nerve, and also sometimes tonsil of cerebellum. As only the nerves and vessels are passing through the posterior compartment, it is called as neurovascular compartment, but through the anterior compartment ligaments are passing, that is why it is called as osteoligamentous compartment. In addition to it, the anterior margin of this foramen magnum, there is an attachment of the anterior atlanto-occipital membrane, and through the posterior margin of the foramen magnum, there is attachment of the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane. Okay. Now coming to the center of this posterior cranial fossa, there lies an irregular elevation. This is called as internal occipital protuberance. On each side, from the internal occipital protuberance, a sulcus is running. This is called as transverse sulcus, and it lodges the transverse sinus. This one is the sigmoid sulcus. The sigmoid sulcus is continuation of the transverse sulcus, okay, and the transverse sinus sulcus lodges the transverse sinus and sigmoid sulcus lodges the sigmoid sinus. Transverse sinus is formed by tentorium cerebelli and drains into right and left sigmoid sinus. Now, internal occipital protuberance is also called as the area of confluence of sinuses. Why? Because here superior sagittal sinus and then straight sinus and occipital sinus drains. Okay, and it is also the meeting point of fox cerebri and tentorium cerebelli. This internal occipital protuberance and this transverse sulcus divides this posterior cranial fossa into two upper and two lower fossas. Two lower fossa is quadrangular in shape and it lodges right and left cerebellar hemispheres, and upper is the triangular fossa and it lodges occipital lobes of the cerebrum. You can see that there is a ridge in between this internal occipital protuberance and foramen magnum. There is a prominent ridge. This ridge is called as internal occipital crest. As it goes downward towards the foramen magnum, it divides into two parts, and it gives attachment to the fox cerebelli. And also there is an occipital sinus that lies in between these two that lies in between the attached margin of the fox cerebelli. There is a small depression in the lower part of this internal occipital crest. This is called as Vermian fossa and it is related to the inferior vermis of the cerebellum. With this, I hope that the internal surface of the cranial base is completed, and I hope you all understood it well. Thanks for watching.